Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start with a question. What if I told you that everything you need to live a life of purpose, courage, and joy is already inside you? It's true, your mind holds a treasure and extraordinary power, but here's the thing. Most of us spend our lives guarding the door to that treasure chest without ever turning the key. I know this because I spent years standing at that door myself, terrified if I dared to open it. What if I told you that everything you need to live a life of purpose, courage, and joy is already inside you? That the answers you've been searching for, the clarity you crave, and the breakthroughs you dream about, they're not out there somewhere waiting to be found. They're right here, within you, waiting for you to stop searching and start seeing. I remember the first time I truly grasped this idea. I was sitting alone in my car, about to walk into a room full of strangers and give a talk I didn't feel ready to give. My palms were sweating. My stomach felt like it had turned inside out. And my mind was running wild with stories. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're going to mess this up. You see, I had prepared for weeks. I knew my material backward and forward. I had rehearsed in front of mirrors, pets, and even an unsuspecting neighbor who just came by to borrow some sugar. But none of that seemed to matter in that moment, because the voice in my head, the one we all have, was louder than any preparation I'd done. I sat there, frozen by fear, and I almost turned the car around. I almost gave in to the part of me that said, this isn't worth it. Just play it safe. Don't risk looking foolish. But then something shifted. I remembered something a mentor once told me. She said, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's fear walking. And that was it. That was the reminder I needed that fear wasn't a stop sign, it was a signal. A signal that I was stepping into something bigger than myself. A signal that I was about to grow. And so I took a breath. I opened the car door, and I walked inside. And here's what happened. I stood on that stage, heart pounding, voice shaking, and I told the truth. I didn't hide my nerves. I didn't pretend to have it all together. I spoke from the heart, and people listened. Not because I was perfect, but because I was real. I learned something that day. I learned that the mind isn't just a container for thoughts. It's a storyteller. And more often than not, it's a storyteller that gets stuck in old, familiar scripts about what's possible, what's safe, and what's allowed. But here's the thing about stories, they can be rewritten. I started asking myself, what if the voice in my head isn't the voice of truth? What if it's just the voice of habit? And what if I don't have to believe everything it says? I started to realize that our minds, your mind, my mind are like treasure chests locked by years of fear, doubt, and limiting beliefs. And unlocking that treasure isn't about waiting for someone else to hand us the key. It's about realizing that the key is already in our hands. The truth is, every single one of us has a secret power hidden inside us, but most of us are so focused on protecting ourselves, on avoiding failure or rejection, that we never even try to tap into it. And that's heartbreaking, because I believe that the world needs more people who are willing to unlock what's inside of them. It needs more voices, more ideas, more courage, and not the kind of courage that's loud and fearless. I'm talking about quiet courage, the kind that whispers, try anyway, show up anyway, speak up anyway. Because that's the courage that changes things. It's the courage that builds bridges, heals wounds, starts movements, and transforms lives. And it all starts in the mind with the stories we tell ourselves and the beliefs we choose to hold. So I want to ask you today, what stories are you telling yourself? Are they stories of scarcity, fear, and doubt? Or are they stories of possibility, courage, and hope? And more importantly, are you ready to rewrite them? Because that moment I stepped out of my car and walked into that room wasn't the moment I suddenly became fearless. It was the moment I decided to stop letting fear hold the pen. It was the moment I chose to unlock the treasure inside me instead of keeping it locked away. And if I can do it, so can you. Fear is a funny thing, isn't it? It doesn't always show up as panic or terror. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the quiet hesitation that keeps us from speaking up in a meeting. It's the sinking feeling in our stomachs when we think about trying something new. It's the small, almost imperceptible tug that pulls us back when we're about to step outside of our comfort zone. I know that tug well. I felt it so many times, especially in the moments when it mattered most, when the stakes were high and the risk of failure felt real. And let's be honest, failure is real. Rejection is real. Vulnerability is real. That's why fear feels so convincing. It's not imaginary. It's not made up. It's based on something deeply human, our need to feel safe. But here's what I've learned about fear. It's also a liar. Fear tells us that safety is the same thing as happiness, that staying small is the same thing as staying whole. But that's not true. Staying small might feel safe, but it's also suffocating. It keeps us from breathing fully, living fully, and being fully who we're meant to be. I remember a time when I let fear convince me that I wasn't ready. I had been invited to share my story at a conference, a room full of leaders, thinkers, and people I deeply admired. And I almost said no, not because I didn't want to do it, but because fear had already started writing the script in my head. What if you mess up? What if you forget your words? What if you don't belong there? It's amazing how fast fear can spiral. What started as a flicker of doubt turned into an avalanche of what ifs, each one heavier than the last. And I wish I could tell you that I silenced those thoughts with one big, confident decision. But I didn't. What I did was smaller than that. I took one shaky breath, and then I took one shaky step, and then another, and then another. Until eventually I found myself on that stage, speaking the truth, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had decided that my voice mattered more than my fear. And that's what I want you to hear today. Fear doesn't disappear. It doesn't go away just because we want it to. But it also doesn't have to control us. It doesn't have to hold the keys to our lives. The problem is that most of us let fear build walls around us, walls we think are protecting us, but really they're trapping us. They keep us locked inside stories about what we can't do, what we're not ready for, and what will happen if we fail. But what if those walls aren't as solid as we think they are? What if they're more like glass than concrete, fragile, breakable, and easier to shatter than we realize? And I think about a friend of mine who spent years stuck behind those walls. She had a dream of starting her own business, but convinced herself it wasn't possible. She told herself she wasn't smart enough, experienced enough, or connected enough. And every time an opportunity came her way, she let fear shut the door. But one day, something shifted. She got tired of waiting to feel ready, waiting for permission, waiting for the fear to go away. So she stopped waiting. She took the first step. And it wasn't perfect. She stumbled, made mistakes, and faced rejection. But do you know what else happened? She grew. And that's the thing about fear. It doesn't shrink when we avoid it. It grows. But when we face it, when we walk straight into it, it loses its power. Because the truth is, fear isn't the enemy. Fear is the test. It's the doorway we have to walk through if we want to reach the other side, the side where growth happens, where courage is built, and where freedom is found. But walking through that doorway requires something that doesn't come naturally to most of us. It requires vulnerability. And let's be honest, vulnerability is uncomfortable. It's exposing. It's like standing in the middle of a room without armor, without protection, and hoping no one notices the cracks. But here's the paradox. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's strength. It's the willingness to show up and be seen even when there are no guarantees. I think back to that moment in my car, the moment before my first big talk. I was terrified. But the thing that got me out of that car wasn't confidence. It was vulnerability. It was the decision to show up even though I felt unready, even though I felt exposed. And that decision changed everything. Because when we dare to be vulnerable, we give ourselves permission to be human, to be messy, imperfect, and brave all at the same time. I want you to think about what fear is keeping you from right now. What door are you standing in front of, too scared to open? What story are you telling yourself about why you can't, why you shouldn't, or why it won't work? And then I want you to imagine what might be possible if you stopped listening to that story, if you decided to walk through the fear instead of around it. Because the truth is, fear only has the power we give it. And when we stop letting it decide what we do, we start unlocking parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed. We start discovering the strength, courage, and resilience that's been there all along, just waiting for us to let it out. The most fascinating thing about the stories we tell ourselves is how quickly they become the walls we live inside. They start as thoughts, small, fleeting doubts, and before we know it, they've grown into rules we don't even question. Rules about who we are, what we're capable of, and what's possible for us. And the scariest part, most of these stories are inherited. We don't even write them ourselves. They come from our past experiences, from the voices of people we trusted, from moments when we felt small or invisible. They shape us before we even realize we're being shaped. I remember the first time I really questioned one of those stories. I was in college and I had just failed a big exam. Not barely passed, failed, full on big red letter F. And the story I told myself in that moment wasn't just about the test. It was about me. It was about what that grade meant, that I wasn't smart enough, that I didn't belong, that I wasn't the kind of person who succeeded. And here's the thing about stories like that: they don't stay in one part of your life. They spread. That one failure started to color how I saw myself in everything I did. I started playing small, turning down opportunities, and convincing myself I wasn't ready because that story had become a belief. It wasn't until years later that I learned something that changed my life. The brain is wired to believe whatever we repeat to it. Scientists call it neuroplasticity, but to me it felt more like magic. The idea that our thoughts don't just describe reality, they create it was both terrifying and empowering. It meant that if I could believe myself into feeling small, I could also believe myself into feeling strong. I started paying attention to my thoughts. I wrote them down, and I was shocked at how harsh they were. It was like living with a critic who never took a day off. And that's when I realized if I wanted to change my life, I had to change the way I talked to myself. So I did. Not overnight, not perfectly, but intentionally. I started rewriting the script. Instead of saying, I can't do this, I said, I'm learning how to do this. Instead of saying, I'm not ready, I said, I'm brave enough to try. And something incredible happened. My actions started to follow my words. I stopped waiting to feel confident and started acting as though I already was. And do you know what? Confidence caught up. It always does. That's the power of our minds. It's not just about positive thinking, it's about possibility thinking. It's about giving ourselves permission to believe in something bigger than the fear, bigger than the doubt, bigger than the voice that says, who do you think you are? Because the truth is, who we think we are is often just a reflection of who we used to be. It's based on old evidence we've outgrown but haven't let go of. And if we're not careful, we let that old evidence define our future. I think about someone I met a few years ago, a woman who had spent most of her life feeling invisible. She had dreams of starting her own business, but every time she thought about taking the first step, her mind shut her down. You're not a leader. You're not experienced. People won't take you seriously. But something shifted when she realized that those thoughts weren't facts. They were echoes of old experiences, moments when she had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. The problem wasn't who she was, it was what she had been taught to believe about herself. So she decided to rewrite her story. She started small, networking, learning, showing up to spaces that intimidated her. And it was messy. There were setbacks and missteps and moments when she wanted to give up. But she didn't. She kept going. And a year later, she launched her business. What struck me most about her wasn't just her courage. It was her ability to rewrite the narrative she had been living in for so long. She didn't erase the past, she reframed it. She took the lessons, left the shame, and wrote herself a new role. And that's what we all have the power to do. The stories we tell ourselves can either trap us or transform us. They can keep us locked in cycles of fear and self-doubt, or they can set us free to imagine, create, and grow. But rewriting those stories takes work. It takes awareness. It takes a willingness to look at the thoughts we've been carrying and ask, is this true, not does it feel true? Because let's be honest, fear always feels true. But is it actually true? Most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, it's just a habit, a thought we've rehearsed so many times that it feels like fact. But the beautiful thing about habits is that they can be changed. And the beautiful thing about thoughts is that we get to choose them. So what if we chose better ones? What if we decided that instead of letting our past define us, we would let our vision for the future lead us? What if we stopped asking, what if I fail, and started asking, what if I fly? Because that's what rewriting your story is all about. It's not pretending the fear isn't there. It's not ignoring the doubts. It's acknowledging them and deciding they don't get to have the final say. And when we do that, when we take back the pen and start writing from a place of courage, instead of fear, we don't just change our own lives. We change the lives of everyone we touch. Because courage is contagious. Growth is contagious. And when one person decides to rewrite their story, it gives everyone around them permission to do the same. Courage, curiosity, and compassion, these are the tools we often overlook, yet they are the very tools we need to shape our lives. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that whispers, try again tomorrow. It's not loud or dramatic. It's often soft and persistent, like a heartbeat reminding us we're still alive, still capable, still here. I think about courage the way I think about muscles. It's not something we're born with fully developed. It's something we build one small act at a time. The first step is always the hardest because it feels the most fragile, but every step after that gets a little steadier. And before we know it, what once felt impossible becomes second nature. I remember one of my earliest lessons in courage. I was standing at the edge of a diving board maybe 10 feet high, but at the time it felt like 10,000. I must have walked to the edge and back at least 5 times, staring down at the water below and imagining every way it could go wrong. My friends were watching, cheering me on, but their voices couldn't drown out the noise in my head, the fear, the self-doubt, the what-ifs. And then something shifted. I stopped trying to silence the fear and started asking myself a different question. What if I don't jump? What if I stay stuck here, waiting for the fear to go away? What will I miss out on if I keep waiting for courage to feel easy? So I jumped, not gracefully, not confidently, but I jumped. And the moment my feet hit the water, I felt it, that rush, that electricity, that sense of being fully alive. It wasn't the jump itself that changed me. It was the decision to trust myself enough to take it. Courage is like that. It's not about eliminating fear, it's about choosing to move forward anyway. And the beautiful thing is that courage has a ripple effect. Every time we face one fear, we weaken the next one. Every time we take one brave step, we make the next step a little less scary. But courage doesn't work alone. It needs curiosity, the willingness to ask questions, to look deeper, to wonder what's possible instead of assuming what isn't. Curiosity is the antidote to fear because it shifts our focus from what could go wrong to what could go right. I think about how children approach the world with eyes wide open, hands reaching out, and 1,000 questions bubbling up all at once. They aren't afraid to be curious. They aren't afraid to explore. But somewhere along the way, we stop asking questions. We start believing that we're supposed to have all the answers, that uncertainty is dangerous, and that not knowing is a weakness. But curiosity is the exact opposite of weakness. It's strength, it's resilience. It's the ability to stay open when everything in us wants to shut down. And when we combine curiosity with courage, we create momentum. We move forward, not always in straight lines, but forward nonetheless. I think about a friend of mine who faced an unexpected career change after years of climbing the corporate ladder. She could have let fear stop her. She could have retreated, played it safe, and tried to rebuild what she lost. But instead, she leaned into curiosity. She started asking questions about what she loved, what she wanted, and what might be possible if she let herself dream again. And that curiosity led her somewhere completely unexpected. It didn't just help her rebuild her life, it helped her reinvent it. That's the power of curiosity. It doesn't just give us answers, it gives us options. It reminds us that we're not stuck, that we're not limited, that there's always more to discover if we're willing to keep exploring. But there's one more tool we need: compassion. And not just compassion for others, but compassion for ourselves. Because growth is messy. Change is uncomfortable. And no matter how brave or curious we are, there will be moments when we fall short, when we make mistakes, when we feel like we've taken 10 steps backward for every one step forward. And in those moments, what we need most isn't criticism, it's kindness. We need the ability to look at ourselves, not with judgment, but with understanding. To say, this is hard and I'm doing my best. I think about a time when I was struggling with burnout, trying to juggle too many things at once and feeling like I was failing at all of them. My instinct was to push harder, to try to fix it, to make it look like I had it all together. But what I really needed was rest. What I really needed was permission to pause, to breathe, and to remind myself that I didn't have to have it all figured out. And the funny thing is, the moment I gave myself that permission, the moment I stopped fighting so hard to be perfect, was the moment I started to feel strong again. Because self-compassion doesn't make us weaker, it makes us braver. It gives us the resilience to keep going even when things get hard. I think about the Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, it highlights them. It turns the flaws into beauty, the breaks into something stronger. And I believe that's what self-compassion does for us. It doesn't erase our struggles, it honors them. It shows us that our scars aren't signs of failure, they're signs of survival. And when we bring courage, curiosity, and compassion together, when we use all 3 tools, we stop seeing ourselves as broken and start seeing ourselves as whole. We stop letting fear write our stories and start writing them ourselves. We stop asking, what if I fail? And start asking, what if this is just the beginning? Because transformation isn't one big leap, it's a series of small, brave steps. It's showing up, even when we're scared. It's asking questions, even when we don't have answers. It's offering ourselves grace, even when we feel like we don't deserve it. And every time we do that, every time we take one more step, ask one more question, or show ourselves one more ounce of kindness, we chip away at the layers that hide who we really are. We reveal something that's been there all along, something strong, something beautiful, something worth unlocking. The truth is, transformation doesn't happen in the big, flashy moments. It happens in the quiet, ordinary ones. The ones that don't get applause or recognition. The ones where no one's watching, but you show up anyway. It happens when you decide to take one more step, even when you're tired. When you choose to speak up, even when your voice shakes. When you stop waiting for permission and start believing that you're enough right here, right now. I think about the people I admire most, and what strikes me isn't how fearless they are, but how often they're willing to act in spite of fear. They don't wait to feel ready. They don't wait for certainty. They move forward one uncertain step at a time, and that's what makes them extraordinary, not their perfection, but their persistence. And I think we forget that sometimes. We forget that bravery isn't about the absence of fear. It's about feeling the fear and choosing to move anyway. It's about showing up as we are messy, uncertain, and unfinished, and trusting that who we are is already enough. I remember a conversation I had with a friend who was on the verge of a big career change. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, doing all the right things, and achieving what looked like success from the outside. But inside, she felt empty, like she had built a life that didn't actually fit. And as we talked, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "I'm terrified to start over, but I'm even more terrified to stay stuck." And that's the moment it clicked for her that fear wasn't a sign to stop. It was a sign to pay attention. It was a sign that she was standing on the edge of something that mattered. And instead of running from it, she leaned in. She let herself feel the fear, but she didn't let it decide for her. That's what courage looks like. It's not about getting rid of fear. It's about learning to carry it. It's about learning to walk with it instead of waiting for it to disappear. And when we do that, when we stop letting fear be the driver, we start unlocking parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed. But here's the thing, unlocking those parts isn't a one-time event. It's not something we do once and then we're done. It's a practice. It's a habit. It's a decision we have to make over and over again, especially on the days when it feels hardest. And that's why grace matters so much, because growth isn't linear. It's messy. It's full of false starts and wrong turns and moments when we want to give up. But what matters isn't how many times we fall, it's how many times we choose to get back up. I think about a time when I felt like I had completely failed. I had poured my heart into a project, hours of work, endless preparation, and it flopped. I remember sitting in my car afterward, replaying every mistake in my head and feeling like I wasn't cut out for this work. Like maybe I had reached too far. Maybe I wasn't as brave as I thought I was. But then I asked myself the question that saved me more times than I can count: what am I learning? And that changed everything. Because instead of seeing failure as proof that I wasn't enough, I started seeing it as evidence that I was growing. I started seeing it as part of the process, not the end of the story, but the middle. And that's what we so often forget, that failure isn't final unless we let it be. It's not the thing that defines us, it's the thing that shapes us. It's the thing that forces us to adapt, to learn, and to try again. I think about the people I've met who've built extraordinary lives, and the one thing they all have in common isn't that they never failed. It's that they didn't let failure stop them. They didn't let it close the door. They used it as fuel. And the truth is, we all have that same ability. We all have the ability to rewrite the stories we tell ourselves about failure, about fear, and about what's possible. But we have to be willing to challenge the old narratives. We have to be willing to ask ourselves, what if this isn't the end? What if this is just the beginning? Because the moment we start asking those questions, everything changes. We stop seeing this stop success and stop signs and start seeing them as opportunities. We stop seeing fear as a reason to quit and start seeing it as a reason to keep going. And maybe most importantly, we stop waiting. We stop waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, or the perfect version of ourselves. We start where we are with what we have, and we trust that it's enough. I think about all the people who've told me their stories, the ones who took risks, who stepped out in faith, who walked away from the safe and familiar and dared to build something new. And every single one of them has said the same thing: it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Because the truth is, nothing worth having comes without effort. Nothing worth building happens without discomfort. But the discomfort is what shapes us. It's what forces us to grow. And growth doesn't always feel good in the moment. Sometimes it feels like stretching in ways we didn't think we could stretch. Sometimes it feels like standing in the middle of uncertainty and deciding to trust ourselves anyway. But when we look back, we see that every step, even the messy, imperfect ones, mattered. We see that the times we felt most afraid were also the times we were becoming the most brave. And that's the paradox of growth. It's uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. It's messy, but it's also beautiful. It's uncertain, but it's also full of possibility. And that's why unlocking the power of our minds is so important. Because the limits we face aren't usually out there in the world, they're in here. They're in the thoughts we think and the stories we believe. But the moment we start challenging those stories, when we stop letting fear have the last word and start believing in our own potential, that's the moment we unlock something extraordinary. Not because we become fearless, but because we learn how to move forward with fear. Not because we stop falling, but because we learn how to rise. And in the end, that's what it's all about, showing up again and again. And trusting that even when it's hard, even when it's messy, even when it doesn't look the way we thought it would, it's still worth it. Because the person we become in the process, that's the real reward.